Okay, it said recording has started, so we'll give it a few seconds and then we can get going.
Hi, Stephen. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Robin.
This is becoming a tradition. So I think the huge thing, that the elephant in the room, is this extreme divergence between the more bearish, and I think that would certainly include you as ringleader, analysts, versus the not particularly bearish, slightly bullish ones who believe that we're in relative balance. Certainly, if you look at the 2-year, 24, 25 and 25, 6, you get a kind of balance between the 2 years, and they still believe we're in low stocks, and therefore that there is some possibility of pulling ourselves out of the current rut. So to begin, you're obviously sticking to your point of view, which we greatly respect. But looking through your numbers, they're very similar to mine. So quite why we end up with such a divergence is a bit hard to understand. And I think you pointed out that a lot of it concerns India, and a lot of it concerns consumption. So let's start with the most important point of all, which is Brazil. Do you agree that nobody can yet have a very firm view on Brazil's sugar production? I think you're around 42 million tons. Is that right?
We are, yes. Yes, we're 42.
And I think consensus is 41, possibly increasing a little bit recently, thanks to the good April rains. But there is we hear from a number of mills that that although those rains will certainly have done some good, that will come at the end of the harvest, and in the meantime, the first indications are that in some mills, the quality of the cane and the TCH are appalling, and therefore they think that we will struggle to make more than 580 million tons of cane, and that means sugar 40 million or lower. Any view as to why there is such a discrepancy between some mills and others?
It's difficult because obviously as an analyst, you want to try to understand the overall picture, but by doing that, you turn a couple of hundred mils output into one number.
Yeah.
So everyone will say, what's your number? Well, I'm at 42 million tons of sugar, and somebody else will say, well, that's ridiculous. You should be at 40 million tons.
Yeah.
And CZ has got a large Brazil office with people who go into the countryside, talk to the mills all the time, and so I can fall back on that and say the mills we speak to indicate that 42 is fine. But also we don't talk to every mill, so equally there'll be somebody else who can do the same legwork and end up with a different number. And I also take your point that there is some cane, particularly the cane that gets processed at the beginning of the season, which has had less rainfall. So we know that last year, 2024, the rainfall was particularly low until we got to October. And then this year, February and March weren't wonderful. And I think that will affect the cane that's harvested at the beginning of the season more than the cane harvested at the end of the season. So it could be that we get this uncertainty around Brazil for quite a while yet. The only other point I'd make...
Could it be to do with the divergence between sandy soil and clay soil, where the clay retains moisture and the sandy soil lets it through, and therefore you could have some mills good, some mills bad, depending on the soil they're on?
It's possible. It's also, we've seen in previous seasons, I'm sure you can remember as well, how diverse the weather can be even within a small area within Brazil, where we can talk to some mills and their weather data is completely different to another mill that's nearby. This
Very
is one of
true.
the challenges of forecasting, particularly for Brazil, the cane crop, and it's one of the things that keeps it interesting, I guess. I would agree with you though. I think if you go back to the beginning of this year, I think the consensus number for Central South Brazil was 42, maybe 43 million tons. When we had that poor rainfall in February and March, I think the consensus fell to 40 to 42.
Yeah.
And I think now with the decent rains in April, I think it's just inched up a bit. But broadly speaking, if you had a number between 41 and 42 today, I don't think that's too far out of line with
Right.
anyone else.
Right. And we're not going to get the truth until much later in the year.
No.
That's the problem with big crops. You never find out what the truth is until literally the last month. And I think that applies to India as well. But I think a large amount of your surplus is effectively stock rebuilding, which will have to take place notably in India. According to my figures, Indian stocks fell by 3.5 million tons last year in the last year, and therefore a lot of that will have to be rebuilt before India can be an exporter next year. Off the top of your head, do you see India as an exporter next year?
So we've got 32 million tons of sugar production in our stats for India next year. That is obviously, we haven't had any of the significant weather that will help with the cane growth. So whether that's anywhere near correct or not, we don't know. The acreage should be there to support it, but a lot of things have to happen before we get to that number. Based on having 32 million tons of sugar production, at the moment, we don't have any exports in our numbers. Part of that is because of that stock build that you reference. I think India this year is running its stocks pretty low, at least on paper. And so where we hope we get a domestic surplus next year, that should help rebuild the stocks. And then from then on, everything's in the hands of the government. If they feel like the market is well enough supplied, then I guess it's possible that they allow exports as they did this season. So I don't think that we're in a position where India is going to return as a very large exporter to the world market. The flows we saw in 2020 and 2021, where we were getting 10 million tons across 2 seasons, I think that's gone. So even if India does export in 2025, 26, I think that's at best 1 million tons, maybe 2 million tons.
Yeah, I'd certainly go along with that, and I think it will be a political decision. And the government has this flexibility in how much diversion to ethanol they decide on, and that can certainly leave 1 or 2 million tons free of sugar, free for export. And all of this hinges on the vexed question of consumption. I know we could talk for hours about it and still not reach a conclusion, but you have been brave enough to say that you think world consumption is flat, not growing. And you base a lot of that on appetite-reducing drugs trickling down, becoming cheaper. Does that really account for 2 million tons of sugar consumption lost?
No, not by itself. I don't think so. And also, I should point out that with these drugs like Ozempic and Mounjaro and the rest which are coming through, it's virtually impossible to analyze what they mean because nobody has any data. So I know, for example, surveys have said that 1 in 8 Americans have tried them. But for those 1 in 8 Americans, we don't know what change that led to in their eating habits. So we really are sort of fumbling in the dark with this one. What I would say is that 1 in 8 Americans is kind of mainstream for a drug that's relatively new. The example I always give is if you're in an aircraft with 200 people on board, if you have 1 in 8 people trying have tried Ozempic, that's more than 20 people in the aircraft. It's that to me is mainstream. So what we've done, we know that the drugs are more prevalent in the United States of America. and we think there'll be some impact on consumption there. So we've started to taper our American consumption numbers lower. And it's interesting, a lot of the reports we're getting from the United States this year have been around unexplained lower deliveries for sugar, 1 to 3% people are talking about, and that's starting to come through in the USDA stats. So maybe that's Ozempic, maybe it isn't. And then we're going to do something similar, very, very small tapering of our numbers for other economies where Ozempic is being rolled out. I would also say that semaglutide, the drug in Ozempic, comes off patent in Brazil, India, and China next year. And at that point, maybe then you get more availability and lower cost. Yes.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say, I don't think it's all Ozempic. I haven't gone completely mad. I do also think there's an element still that people are struggling with food price inflation. For most of my adult life, effectively inflation was zero in the United Kingdom. Okay, food prices did rise, but you kind of had prices that you anchored onto, which you knew this is how much this costs, this is how much this costs. And then from 2021, 2022, we had 20% food price inflation. Prices just rocketed. And I'm still at the stage now, a couple of years later, where I go and buy some food, and I'm shocked at the price. And I accept that's what the price is, but I'm still surprised by it. And I think it's taking a very long time for consumers to catch up with the new prices. And I think that is definitely having an impact in the goods that they're buying. And I think that could also, in a lot of countries, be just taking the edge off sugar consumption growth as well. So for 2025, 26, as you said, we've got zero consumption growth globally. And that really is advanced economies. You have a decline, and that's been offset by growth elsewhere.
I know what you mean by inflation. I'm a grandfather, and when I give my granddaughters a present of money, I think it's enormous.
Do they look slightly disappointed? Yes.
Exactly. So all of this is very hard to relate to the price, which is always the case in sugar. What should the price be? Cost of production doesn't really come into it. And the only anchor we have to sort of attach the price to is the ethanol parity. So the ethanol parity today, somewhere between 14.5 and 15 cents per pound sugar equivalent. It has downward pressure, I think. I think it's clear that Trump and Saudi Arabia probably want the ethanol, the crude oil price to settle somewhere between $60 and $65 a barrel.
Yes.
And if that happens, then then the ethanol parity would come down to 14 cents or a bit below. And we all know that the outlying mills that begin first to reduce their sugar mix do so at something like 200 points over the ethanol parity. So you could say that somewhere between 16 and 17 cents, we're going to begin to see that this year. Do you think that the price actually has to go down to very close to the ethanol parity and actually stay there for long enough to get rid of some of this surplus? Or do you think that the price is likely to continue as it has been now for a couple of years almost, flirting with the ethanol parity, staying 2, 3, 4 cents above it, but not actually going down to it and not actually lowering the sugar mix for that reason?
As you said at the beginning, I think I've been fairly bearish on price for the last few months, and I don't have a huge reason to change my mind at the moment. So I think that we will need to go to close to ethanol parity at some point this year. And obviously, if we go close to ethanol parity soon, I mean, it looks like we've gone through 17.50, which has been the 4-year support for sugar. If we continue to slide, then mills can, in theory, adapt their production, and that will impact how much sugar Central South Brazil makes. So we had this discussion earlier about whether 41 or 42 million tons of sugar. If in a month's time the raw sugar futures are at 14 cents, then everyone will be completely changing their numbers. I don't necessarily think it has to happen soon. And obviously, there's a chance that we only get towards ethanol parity in the Brazil season in October, November, which and a lot of the production's in the bag. Yeah, short answer, I think we should go towards ethanol parity this year. I'm nervous about when that happens. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the short term. How about you? Where are you at in this one?
Well, I'm less bearish than you are. I think there still is a significant bullish story. So I think we'll probably continue to flirt with it. But of course, in order to lose some sugar, any significant amount of sugar supply, the ethanol, the sugar price has to go down much closer to the ethanol parity and stay there for a month or two. And that's asking a lot of our unstable sugar price. So I tend to think we probably won't. Just to float the bullish story past you, stocks are still clearly low. They will be rebuilt in the coming year, but they are clearly low in Brazil. They've fallen in Europe, and they must have fallen all around the world because we've been in an inverse spread. So everybody is actually being paid not to keep stock. So stocks are low. The funds are short. The weather risk is there. Weather risk has started to show its head for this year in South China, in the Russian beet areas, even in European beet areas, and we got quite a shock, or I did, by the extreme declines in estimates for Asian production, for India, for Thailand, for Pakistan this year, without any apparent major weather explanation. So I think we have to regard sugar as a weather market, and that, of course, can go two ways. If the weather is particularly good, then of course it's bearish because it means that without even trying, we get extra production. But if the weather does turn, as it has been for the last 2 years, malign, then weather risk has to be factored in. So I think there is a bullish story. If by chance your extra supply is needed for stock building, then I think there is a possibility that if something goes wrong on the weather front, we lose a couple of million tons, Brazil is disappointing, and suddenly we're looking for sugar that doesn't apparently exist, and could only come by going back to a high sugar price and inverse spreads. So I don't think we should completely eliminate the idea that sugar is always subject to the possibility of needing a bit of extra supply, and there's nowhere to go to find it, and we therefore have to go to a higher sugar price. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. Last question, as we're running out of time. Would you regard the future as bullish or bearish for sugar, leaving on one side the fact that clearly you think that this year we probably have to lose a bit of supply by going down to the ethanol parity for some time? But would you say that 26, 27 stretching ahead, are we likely to stay above the ethanol parity, or are we going to go down as we did in 2019 to a situation where the sugar price is constantly jumping a little bit above or a little bit below the ethanol parity?
Wow, that question makes me really nervous, because when we last had a major bull market in 2011, we then had quite a few years of bear market afterwards, a lost decade in the 2010s where sugar prices mostly just went lower and we ended up in and around 10 cents again. I would say for this market, I don't think this bear market will be as long as that. So I think we're in a much shorter cycle of a downtrend. And the two reasons really, I guess. The first is that the sugar market has become increasingly dependent on Brazil. So Centre-South Brazil supplies 70% of the world's raw sugar. And that's really where a lot of the growth is as well. If you look at the growth in sugar production over the last 10 years, a huge amount of that has just come from Centre-South Brazil. And many other countries are below the highs that they've had in the last 10 years. And I don't think that dependency is very healthy, because we know that Brazilian infrastructure and logistics aren't always great. It means the sugar market's very dependent on things like where the Brazilian real trades. And if anything does go wrong in Brazil, then the price will respond. So that's one problem that I see. The other problem is that I think it's becoming obvious as the world tries to decarbonize that a lot of the easy decarbonisation has already happened. And so we're moving into an era where it becomes increasingly hard to decarbonize. And we have an energy crop, sugarcane, sugar beet are both energy crops, particularly sugarcane, which feels like it's a bit underused. I know that we have a very successful ethanol program in India. The Brazilian ethanol market is mature. But elsewhere, I wouldn't say really there's a widespread appreciation of using cane as an energy crop yet. And we also know that we need to decarbonize things like transport, and that usually requires liquid fuels. So I'm hopeful that in the next 5 years, we see a lot more diversification of cane and beet production away from just being a pure sugar product and into other interesting products too, whether that's bioplastics or fuels or whatever. And so hopefully that leads to new sources of demand as well.
That's very interesting. And what you say is borne out by the fact that India is talking about E30, China is talking about E10.
Yes.
I think it's a bit like a tide, it's creeping in. But Stephen, that's all we've got time for. Very interesting. We could have gone on much longer. Thanks very much, and best wishes to all our viewers.
Thank you, Robin.
Thanks a lot. Press the D record button.